My name is Bianca Foster. I'm 30 years old. I work as a pharmacist in Charlotte, North Carolina, and 6 weeks before my own wedding, my fiancé's mother asked me to meet her alone for coffee, slid a thick manila envelope across the table without a word of preamble, and told me quietly that I needed to see what was inside before I signed anything else with her son's name attached to it. Inside were photographs from 3 separate weddings, 3 different brides, all of them. Julian Crosby standing at the altar looking exactly as certain and exactly as in love as he'd looked at me 8 months earlier when he proposed on a beach at sunset with a ring I still at that point wore proudly on my hand. I want to tell you what I found out over the following 3 weeks because the actual twist in this story isn't simply that he'd been married before. It's what one of those marriages had never actually finished becoming, and what that meant quietly for every single day I'd spent planning a wedding of my own. Before I get into it, if you've ever had someone show you undeniable proof of something you desperately, genuinely didn't want to believe was true, this story is for you. Subscribe now if that resonates with you and drop a comment telling me where exactly you're watching from tonight, because I genuinely read every single one of them. I need to tell you about Julian first because none of what happened at that coffee shop makes sense without understanding exactly who I thought I was marrying. I met Julian 2 years ago at a mutual friend's dinner party, and he was from that very first conversation effortlessly charming in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced attentive quick to laugh, the kind of man who asked thoughtful follow-up questions instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk. He worked as a yacht broker, a job that explained the frequent travel, the polished wardrobe, the easy familiarity with cities. I'd never visited myself. Charleston, Newport, a stretch of time in Naples, he mentioned occasionally without much detail. He remembered from a single offhand comment I'd made early on that I disliked cilantro and never once let it end up on a shared plate again for 2 full years. He learned my mother's birthday without being told twice, sent flowers on the anniversary of my father's passing without me ever having to ask. Looking back now, I've had to sit with an uncomfortable realization that a man who has done this 3 times before probably has an extraordinarily refined sense of exactly which small gestures make a woman feel deeply, uniquely seen. I fell for him steadily over those 2 years, the way you fall for someone who seems to genuinely enjoy the specific, ordinary version of you, not just the exciting parts. He never once mentioned a previous marriage, and honestly, it never occurred to me to ask directly the way it might not occur to you to ask a 31-year-old whether he'd already been legally married and divorced twice before you met him, because the assumption, unspoken but very real, is that something that significant simply comes up naturally in 2 years of dating someone seriously. He proposed 8 months ago on the beach in front of a small bonfire he'd arranged with a caterer friend, string lights woven through driftwood, my favorite song playing quietly from a speaker tucked into the sand, and I said yes immediately, certain in that fire-lit moment that I had found exactly the partner I wanted for the rest of my life. We'd set a wedding date 6 weeks out from the coffee shop meeting. I'm about to describe a modest ceremony at a botanical garden outside the city, close friends and family, the kind of wedding that felt personal rather than performative, exactly the kind of quiet, meaningful day I'd always pictured. Julian's mother, Vivian, had always been polite to me, warm in a slightly formal way, the kind of mother-in-law who remembers your favorite flowers, but keeps a careful distance emotionally, never quite letting you fully in. I'd assumed that was simply her personality, reserved, a little guarded. I would come to understand sitting across from her at that coffee shop exactly what she'd actually been guarding. She called me on a Tuesday, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it, and asked if I could meet her alone without Julian that same afternoon. I remember feeling a small flutter of unease driving to meet her, though I told myself it was probably wedding logistics, seating charts, some detail she wanted to discuss privately. If you're already curious and a little unsettled, stay with me because it gets much more interesting before it resolves. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know because I genuinely read every single one. Vivian was already seated when I arrived, a manila envelope sitting on the table in front of her, her hands folded tightly over it, her coffee untouched and gone cold beside it, which told me before she said a single word that she'd been sitting there considerably longer than our agreed meeting time. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Bianca, I need you to look at something before you go one step further with this wedding. I should have shown you this months ago, and I'm ashamed that I let it get this close to the date instead. She slid the envelope across the table, her hand trembling slightly as she did. Inside were photographs printed from what looked like old digital files. Some of them slightly faded, the paper stock, inconsistent, clearly gathered from different sources, over different years of Julian standing at 3 separate altars in 3 separate decades of what appeared to be his adult life, though the years, I would soon learn, were actually much closer together than the aging venues and outfits made them initially appear. The first photo showed Julian younger, maybe 26, marrying a woman named Rachel, in what looked like a courthouse ceremony. Both of them laughing at something just out of frame, genuinely happy in the specific unguarded way you only capture by accident. The second showed him at 28 marrying a woman named Denise, a small outdoor ceremony similar in style to the one we'd planned for our own wedding, string lights, a small string quartet visible in the background. The third showed him at 31, just 2 years before he met me, marrying a woman named Carla. A larger, more formal event with what looked like close to 100 guests. Julian in a tailored tuxedo that I recognized with a small jolt as nearly identical to the one he'd already had fitted for our own upcoming wedding. I sat there for a long moment, flipping through the photographs a second time, then a third, as though repetition might somehow change what I was looking at. I want to pause the story here and ask you something because I've thought about it constantly since. If you were sitting across from your fiancé's own mother looking at photographic proof of 3 marriages you'd never once heard mentioned, what would your very first question have been? Would you have wanted to know why? Or would you have wanted to know how something that significant simply never surfaced across 2 full years of dating? Tell me in the comments, because mine surprised even me in that moment. And I still think the specific question you'd ask first says something real about what actually matters most to you in a relationship. How I asked, my voice barely steady, does someone get married 3 times by 31 without any of it ever coming up? Vivian's expression was somewhere between grief and exhaustion, the look of a mother who has spent years quietly absorbing something she couldn't bring herself to fully name out loud. Because he's very good at making each one feel like a small private thing, and very good at making sure the people in his current life never cross paths with the people in his previous one. Rachel lived in Savannah. Denise lived in Richmond. Carla lived here in Charlotte, actually, for about 18 months before things ended, and she moved to Chicago. He's careful. He always has been. I raised him to be thoughtful, and somewhere along the way, he learned to use that thoughtfulness as a kind of camouflage instead. I asked her plainly why she'd waited until 6 weeks before my own wedding to tell me any of this. She was quiet for a long moment. I kept telling myself each time that this one would be different, that he'd finally grown into being the kind of man who stays. I told myself that with Denise. I told myself that with Carla. I watched 3 women build entire lives around him, and I watched all 3 of those lives collapse within 2 to 3 years every single time. I should have said something to Rachel. I should have said something to Denise. I told myself both times it wasn't my place to interfere. I am not making that mistake a 3rd time. If you're wondering what you would have done in that exact moment, hearing your future mother-in-law describe a pattern that specific, that repeated, I want to ask you directly. Would you have believed her immediately, or would some part of you have wanted to hear Julian's side first? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely wrestled with both instincts sitting in that coffee shop. I didn't confront Julian that same day. I drove home, sat in my parked car outside my own apartment for nearly an hour, and did the only thing that has ever steadied me when something feels too enormous to process in the moment. I called my closest friend Monique, who works as a paralegal, and told her everything. Monique was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said something that reframed the entire situation for me. Bianca, I need you to hear this clearly. 3 marriages by 31 isn't just a red flag about commitment. If any of those marriages weren't properly legally dissolved before the next one started, you're not just marrying a man with a complicated past. You could be marrying into a legal mess that makes your own marriage invalid before it even begins. You need to verify every single one of those before you do anything else. I want to pause here and tell you honestly that possibility hadn't even occurred to me yet, sitting in my car with those photographs still in my bag. It would end up being the exact thread that unraveled everything else. Over the following 10 days, Monique helped me methodically pull public marriage and divorce records from 3 different state court systems: Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. The two of us hunched over her laptop most evenings after work, a bottle of wine between us that neither of us drank much of, too focused on the search fields and case numbers scrolling past. The first marriage to Rachel had been formally annulled within 4 months, clean, documented, no lingering paperwork. Out of pure curiosity and a growing need to understand the full pattern, rather than just my own immediate crisis, I reached out to Rachel too, through a distant mutual connection Monique tracked down. Rachel responded warmly, almost relieved to talk about it after so many years, and told me the annulment had happened quickly because she'd discovered within weeks of their courthouse wedding that Julian had never actually been fully honest about his finances beforehand, debts he'd downplayed significantly, though nothing quite as serious as what I was now uncovering. "I got out fast and clean," she told me. "I've always wondered about the ones after me." She asked quietly near the end of our call whether I thought he'd changed much since her. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure anymore what parts of him had ever been real to begin with, and what parts had simply been very good performances repeated across several different women. The third marriage to Carla had ended in a properly finalized divorce 18 months before Julian and I even met. Also clean, also fully documented, filed by Carla herself, according to the public record, rather than by Julian. A small detail that told me something too, that at least one of these women had walked away with enough clarity and resolve to handle her own paperwork properly, unwilling to leave anything unfinished the way Denise unknowingly had. The second marriage to Denise in Richmond told a very different story. There was no divorce decree filed anywhere in the Virginia court system. No annulment, no legal separation agreement. Just a marriage license dated 6 years ago, with no corresponding dissolution paperwork of any kind attached to it anywhere in any county Monique could find. And we checked methodically every adjacent county Denise might plausibly have filed in during those years. I want you to sit with that discovery the way I had to sit with it, staring at my laptop screen at nearly midnight. Monique quiet beside me, both of us realizing at almost the same moment what we were actually looking at. If that marriage had never been legally dissolved, Julian Cross was still technically legally married to a woman named Denise somewhere in Virginia 6 years later while planning to marry me in 6 weeks, and had apparently been legally married to her the entire time he was also married to Carla, a detail neither Carla nor Julian himself seemed to have ever noticed or questioned. If you're already feeling your stomach turn a little, the way mine did stay with me, because it gets more complicated before it gets fully resolved. And if this is hitting close to home for you, drop a comment and let me know. Because I genuinely read every single one. Monique found Denise's current contact information through a professional networking site 3 days later, a cautious, careful message explaining who we were and why we were reaching out. Denise responded within hours, and what she told us over a long phone call the following evening filled in the picture completely. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor for that call the same way I imagine so many difficult conversations end up happening on kitchen floors. Some strange instinct to be lower to the ground when the world feels unsteady. She and Julian had separated 5 years ago after roughly a year and a half of marriage, under circumstances she described as quietly falling apart, rather than dramatically ending, the two of them simply drifting into separate lives without ever formally finishing the legal process. Both of them, in her words too, exhausted by the end of it, to deal with lawyers and paperwork on top of everything else. She had assumed for years that Julian had eventually filed the divorce paperwork himself, since he'd mentioned once in a brief, awkward phone call roughly 3 years ago that he was handling it. She had never checked. She had in fact remarried herself 2 years ago, a small, quiet ceremony with a man named Patrick who worked in accounting, and the news that her own marriage to her current husband might carry unexpected legal complications since her divorce from Julian had apparently never actually been finalized, hit her with an entirely separate wave of shock I hadn't fully anticipated when Monique and I first reached out. "I need to call my own lawyer immediately," Denise said, her voice tight, with a completely different kind of alarm than mine, and I could hear even over the phone the specific sound of someone doing rapid mental math about the last 2 years of their own life. If Julian never filed that divorce, I might be the one with a legal problem here too. Patrick and I bought a house together last year. If we're not actually legally married, I don't even know what that means for any of it. I want to ask you something here because I've turned it over constantly since. Do you think Julian genuinely believed all these years that the paperwork had somehow been handled without him? Or do you think he simply never bothered to think about the consequences at all moving forward into each new relationship without ever properly closing the last one? Tell me what you think in the comments because Denise and I have discussed this exact question more than once since that call. I confronted Julian 4 days later at our own apartment, choosing an evening when I knew we'd have uninterrupted time laying the photographs and the court records on our kitchen table between us, watching his face shift from confusion into something considerably more careful once he understood exactly what I was holding. He'd walked in, still loosening his tie from work, calling out a cheerful hello that died somewhere in his throat the moment he saw my face, and the papers spread across the table. "Bianca, I can explain all of this," he said, reaching for the papers, and I moved them slightly out of his reach. "Explain the part where you're still legally married to Denise," I said as evenly as I could manage, though my hands were shaking beneath the table where he couldn't see them. "That's the part I actually need explained." He was quiet for a long moment, sitting down slowly across from me, and then in a voice that had lost all of its usual easy confidence, he admitted that he genuinely hadn't followed up on the paperwork after their separation, that he'd assumed in the specific convenient way people assume things they don't want to actually confront, that it had simply resolved itself somewhere in the years since. "I wasn't trying to deceive you," he said. "I honestly forgot it was even still open. Denise and we stopped talking and I moved and it never came up again, and somewhere along the way, I convinced myself it must have gotten handled." I told him plainly that forgetting an active, undissolved marriage while planning a wedding to someone else wasn't the kind of thing that happened by accident, not for 6 full years. Not when the paperwork existed in a public record he'd simply never bothered to check not once in 6 years, across 2 entire relationships that followed it. "You proposed to Carla while still legally married to Denise," I said. "And then you proposed to me while still legally married to Denise. That's not forgetting Julian. That's just never caring enough to look." He didn't have a real answer for that. He sat with his head in his hands for a long time, and when he finally spoke again, it wasn't an apology so much as an admission. "I think I've just never really stopped to deal with any of it properly. I go from one thing to the next, and I don't look back because looking back has never felt like it was worth the trouble. Here's where things stand now. Our wedding obviously did not happen. Julian is currently working through the actual formal dissolution of his marriage to Denise, a process both she and her current husband are now handling with their own separate legal counsel given the unexpected complications it created for her own remarriage as well. Something Denise told me, her husband took considerably harder than she expected. Understandably shaken to learn his own marriage had been sitting on uncertain legal ground for 2 years without either of them knowing it. I've since learned through Vivian, who has stayed unexpectedly close to me through all of this calling every few weeks, just to check in that Julian has started seeing someone new already. A woman he met roughly 2 months after our engagement ended, and Vivian, to her credit, told me she has already made a point of sitting that woman down to manila envelope, and all unwilling to let a 4th version of this same story unfold, without at least trying to stop it earlier this time. "I failed 3 women before you," she told me. "I'm not failing a 4th, just to keep the peace in my own son's life." Denise and I have stayed in touch since that first phone call, an unexpected friendship built entirely out of the strangest possible shared circumstance. 2 women who loved the same man at different points in his life, both blindsided by the exact same pattern of convenient forgetting. She told me recently that finally, properly, legally closing that old marriage felt like setting down a weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying for 6 years. A strange, low hum of unfinished business she'd simply learned to live around without ever fully understanding why it lingered. Rachel, too, reached out again a few weeks after our initial conversation, curious how everything had unfolded. And the three of us, Rachel, Denise, and I, have half-joked more than once about starting an actual support group. Something we laugh about now, though I know all three of us mean it a little more seriously than we let on three women who never expected to become each other's closest confidants, brought together entirely by one man's refusal to ever fully close a door behind him. I moved out of the apartment Julian and I shared within 2 weeks of that kitchen table conversation, staying with Monique for the first month, while I found my own place, and I've spent the months since rebuilding a version of my own life that doesn't have his particular gravity pulling at the center of it, learning slowly what it feels like to make plans that don't depend on anyone else's unfinished history catching up with them. Monique still teases me gently about becoming her favorite research project, though I know she means it as the compliment. It actually is a reminder that checking the paperwork, however unromantic it feels in the moment, is sometimes the single most important thing you can do for yourself. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Charm can survive almost any amount of scrutiny except the specific, boring, undeniable kind that comes from an actual public record. If someone's past feels a little too smooth, a little too conveniently vague, it costs nothing to check, and it can save you from building your entire future on top of something that was never actually finished the first time. A person can be genuinely warm, genuinely attentive, and still be someone who has never once looked back to clean up what he left behind. And those two things I've learned are not actually as contradictory as you'd hope they'd be. If this reminded you of a moment when a little bit of paperwork could have saved you from a much bigger heartbreak, share this with someone who'd understand, someone who might need permission to check something they've been quietly wondering about. Tell me in the comments, would you have believed Vivian immediately without hesitation the way I eventually did, or would you have needed Julian's side of the story first, no matter how damning the photographs looked sitting on that table? And tell me, honestly, do you think a mother should ever step in like Vivian did, or is that crossing a line no matter how many times she'd already watched it happen before? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. I'll see you in the next one.